I'm the COO of SoapBox Labs. We build speech technology for kids. You might be asking yourself, what does a COO of a speech tech company do? Well, my role is kind of a combination between Winston the cleaner wolf from Pulp Fiction and Winnie the Pooh, if you can imagine that, right? It's kind of a combination of those two things. We've been up and running for about 5 years. We're an Irish company, very proudly Irish company. We're an AI business. We're about 15 people. We're located in Newmarket Square in Dublin 8. And I guess, the whole voice space has really taken off in the last 3 or 4 years. So how many people in this room use voice to interact with technology? Hands up. So that's lots of you. And keep your hands in the air, please. And keep your hands in the air if you're also a parent. So you are my sweet spot, right? Voice, parents. I'm not excluding anybody, but you're my sweet spot. And actually this week in Fortune magazine, they described voice as a monumental change in computing. And it is, because it's fast becoming the most common way that we interact with technology. And what I want to talk about this morning is really this afternoon is three key points. One is that voice is the most natural interface for technology, and the reason for that is it has the potential to be frictionless, and that's really important. The second point is that actually it represents a data collection exercise on a scale that is unprecedented, and that raises all sorts of privacy concerns. Right, so that's the second point. And the third point is that what we're doing at SoapBox Labs is very much taking a kind of a privacy-first approach to that for kids, but actually a lot of the principles that we use ought to be also applied to voice for adults, and hopefully those three messages will come through today. So what's changed around voice? So there's a cartoon, a bit of an in-joke in the speech technology space. So on the left-hand side here, you have a guy who's created a new speech recognition program, and on the right, this is the output: K-Severe, chicken manure, peach wreck, ignition, bro ham. So that's kind of where voice technology was up until very recently. Accuracy levels were very poor, and they were basically unusable, so we weren't interfacing with them. Now we have a situation where we have large tech companies spending billions of dollars on the basis that voice is the new interface. We have accuracy levels of 95% and above, which is pretty much as good as a human, right? So 95% and above is kind of the holy grail in speech technology. And what's changed really over the last sort of 5 to 10 years is that we have now the capacity to process vast quantities of data. And data is essential and core to building accurate speech technology systems. We can now give the illusion of kind of real-time conversational interactions. And I say illusion advisedly, and hopefully the reason I use that word will come out in the rest of this talk. We can now apply AI techniques like deep learning, deep neural nets to vast quantities of data. We can have natural language processing, and we can infer meaning from what people are saying. So the kind of responses that we can get now are the ones that you will be accustomed to with your smart assistants. What it also does, and what's often overlooked, is it brings technology to a whole section of the population that may not have been able to interact with technology before as well, in terms of assistive technologies, in terms of low levels of literacy. And there is a very strong AI for good aspect to voice interface, which I will also talk a little bit about later on. So, voice is the natural interface, and everything else really is just a hack, right? Keyboards, mice, all these other ways, buttons that we've kind of invented to try and interact with technology, they're not nearly as good as voice, because voice is the way that we most easily kind of communicate. But more than that, voice has a kind of ephemeral kind of quality, right? When we're talking to people, we might say things like, I'm going to tell you this off the record, right? Don't say this to anybody else. We assume that when we're talking, when we're speaking, except when you're being recorded, that, that there is a kind of a transient nature to what we're saying. We have to give our explicit permission to something to be recorded. And if we go back to, I'm also a bit of a politics nerd, if we go back to the 1970s, right, and Watergate, Nixon was impeached as a result of Watergate. The Watergate scandal was all about this notion that the DNC headquarters was burgled. But actually, the burglary of the DNC headquarters wasn't the thing that brought Nixon down. That was kind of assumed as part of the kind of political game that was happening at the time. Everybody knew that Nixon was up to all sorts of dirty tricks. What brought him down was the fact that he installed listening devices into the White House. in order to be able to listen to conversations that were going on around the committee of inquiry into the burglary. So it was the listening devices, the fact that he had installed these listening devices, that actually brought him down in the end, not the burglary itself. So let's fast forward then 50 years, and here's a stat that came out last week. Over 1 billion devices now provide voice assistant access, and the highest usage on smartphones. So we've gone from a situation where, oh my God, you cannot have listening devices, to a situation where we now have plug-and-play listening devices in our homes. Right? That is quite a big conceptual leap. I know it's 50 years, but come on, it's quite a big conceptual leap. And companies like Amazon employ now 10,000 people to work on Alexa alone. 10,000 people working on Alexa alone. They currently have 2,000 job openings in their Alexa team. Right? So I don't remember the name of the smart working guy's product, but he needs to get on to it. 23% of adults in the US, that's 60 million people, own at least one smart speaker. And smart speakers are only one type of device. They're only one very specific use case for voice technology. But you think 3 years ago we didn't have smart speakers, and now we have 60 million of them in the US alone. They certainly top the list in terms of access to digital assistants. Of course they do, because they don't really do anything else. Right? A smart speaker is access to it. I don't know what the 7% of people who don't access smart assistants through their smart speakers are doing with them, because that's all they do. But you can see on this list, right, so we have smartphones, we have cars. Right, who uses voice interface in a car? I can guarantee you, if I ask that question in a year's time, nearly all of you will put your hands up. Well, if you've managed to get a new car, right? But in-car voice interface is going to be huge. You've got headphones, you've got PCs, TVs, smartwatches. All of these things are starting to use voice interface in order to interact with them. So as I said, smart speakers are only one very narrow use case. And if we look at this diagram here, you think about 2011 was the real kind of consumer-led launch of smart assistants with Siri. So Apple bought out Siri on the iPhone 4S in 2011. Apple, unfortunately, have lost a lot of ground in the meantime, and there's some great articles online as to why that has happened. We have the Amazon Echo in 2014, so only 4 years ago. Google Home, so Echo is Amazon's principal device for accessing Alexa. And in 2018, 1 billion devices, as I said. So what we're seeing in phase 2 is this kind of proliferation of devices with integrated voice assistants. And adoption is driving the integration into these devices. Right? So Amazon launched recently a microwave, which is voice activated. Right? So anything where you can think about how you could improve access via voice will have voice interface integrated with it. And if I just give a very simple example of my own kids, I have 3 kids under 7, they will not search on Netflix without using their voice anymore. They refuse to do it. Right? We have Apple TV in 2 rooms in the house. One is an old Apple TV, one is a new one. The new one has voice interface. They won't use the old one anymore. Because they don't want to go through the process of clicking and spelling and so on. So that's where things are going. It's as big a kind of transformational shift as remember the viral videos of kids trying to swipe TVs and magazines because they're used to like iPad interfaces. This is the way that voice is going. And maybe, I'm not being unkind to the people in the room, I'm including myself in this, maybe we are of a generation that may find it difficult to adapt to that. That's possible. It's possible, right? But it will happen. So my other point here is, and this is where things get a little bit tricky, right? As a global data gathering exercise, actually the rise of voice interface is second to none. Why do I say that, right? So as of this week, Amazon receive 130 million questions and commands per day via Alexa. 130 million per day, right? And that's only 4 years into this growth of voice interface. And think about those voice commands. Every single voice command that goes into any device, not just singling out Alexa here, it's recorded. So every time you use Alexa, your voice is recorded. It's stored. It's processed, right? So it's transcribed. So a permanent record of what you have said is created as part of that process. So go back to my point about this kind of ephemeral quality about voice. Right? As soon as you speak to Alexa, you create a permanent record of that voice transaction. That voice transaction, that transcription is then labeled in all sorts of different ways. Right? And it's mined then for information, for things like inference, right? So inference being, I've understood what you've said, I'm going to give you an answer, which gives you this kind of notion of conversational interface. But also, I can start to understand things about your preferences, about where you're from, about the kind of things you like. I can also, because I've stored your voice, I can also listen to your accent. I can tell what kind of socio-economic class you're from. There's an awful lot that you can do with voice that you cannot do with other types of data that are input using more clunky, less natural interfaces. So the point about this is really that every one of those transactions is transformed from the verbal to the permanent, right? And my point here is really that not all data is created equally, and voice data ought to be treated in a qualitatively different way to any other type of data that is created. And the way that it is treated by the people that process that data ought to be handled slightly differently. So let's think about the journey that your voice data goes on when you use one of these devices. There are three options here, right, in this diagram. So let's start over with the left. So you speak to a device, your voice data is collected, and it is used by the platform to improve the service itself. So all speech recognition requires data in order to get more and more accurate. The more data you have, the more accuracy you can achieve. The more variety of data you have, the more accuracy you can achieve. Right, so very simply, you collect data, we can build better speech technology, full stop. And it can be anonymized, it doesn't have to be linked to an individual. We just need lots of it. In the second scenario, we can use it to profile, right? So if it's linked to you as an individual, and you'll know that if you use one of these devices, you need to have an account, so we know who you are. So we can take that voice data, we can store it against your profile, and we can use that to deliver what's called a better service to you. In other words, I might want to sell you more products. Right, so more of my products, you've bought a product from me, I'm going to send you more of my products. The third scenario is that we do the first one, the second one, but then what we also do is we start aggregating that data together with other data and we sell it on. Right, so we have a business in terms of data processing, aggregation, and advertising. Right, so the holy grail here is start advertising to you. And you will notice the little cactus.
Wild West.
Because it's the Wild West. Right. So, and this is happening, right? And I'm not going to point any fingers at any companies that are doing this, but you have to look at the underlying business models of those companies that are providing voice interface currently and wonder, well, what is it and why are they doing it? So let's look at a few examples of, kind of practical examples of what the implications of that are for us as consumers, right? So recently, Renault, Nissan, I've been in the news this week for very different reasons, but let's watch over that just for now. So they teamed up with Google for their in-car tech. So what they have agreed to do is to integrate Google's technology into the dashboard, right? So what does that mean for me as a consumer? If I go and buy a Renault, do I now have to sign up to Google's privacy terms in order to be able to get the full features of that car? And what happens to the data that's being collected by that car as I'm driving it around, as I'm talking to it, which I will do, right? What are the implications of that for me as a consumer of that particular product? It becomes quite an interesting kind of grey area around the whole privacy space. The alternative is there's a really great company based out in California called SoundHound. They're an independent speech technology provider. They white label their product into automotive manufacturers like Honda, like Mercedes. So they white label that, so Mercedes get to keep all of the data. So in this scenario, your data goes to Google. Google find out lots of interesting things about you. In this scenario, you buy a Honda, all your data stays with Honda. Honda uses the data to sell you more Honda stuff, right? But that's the difference. Okay, so we are facing this kind of inflection point now at the moment, and a difference between where you've got big tech companies with underlying business models which may have other objectives, as opposed to independent voice technology providers, where it's just a focus on the utility of voice interface as part of that product experience. But we're not mining the data for other information. Here's another great one, which I just think has not been explored at any level of detail so far. So your voice is effectively as unique as your fingerprint. Okay, but if I collect lots of voice samples from you, I can basically replicate your voice. Right, and we're going to be using our voices to access services in the future. Voice biometrics is a huge space. So if I'm collecting lots of your voice samples and I know that they're your voice samples, what are the data privacy concerns that we would have around that you could actually recreate my voice by getting enough samples? So, again, reinforcing that point, maybe doing it in a fairly sledgehammer type of a way, but voice data deserves to be treated in a different way than other types of data. Here's another great one that I saw 2 weeks ago, and hopefully this will never be serious for any of you, but a judge in Atlanta 2 weeks ago ordered Amazon to release voice samples related to a certain individual in support of a murder case. Right, so you're speaking to this device, those voice recordings are being made, and look, I'm not going to stand here and say that those devices are always listening, but you've all seen the stories, those stories are true, they are listening, there's a wait word which sets them off in order to record, but in order to be able to hear the wait word, the device has to be listening, right? So it's not supposed to be saving anything, it's not supposed to be storing anything, but it is listening. So what are the privacy implications of this? That you've got your voice data, hopefully none of you get involved in a murder case in this way, but it's just a very interesting way of illustrating the point around the privacy concerns of voice. So, what are we seeing now? We're seeing certain companies like Apple and Microsoft trying to reposition themselves in the market as being the ones that are taking the moral high ground in relation to your personal private data in general, but specifically in relation to voice. Right? Really interesting example recently. I know Facebook has had a few data privacy issues lately. Facebook bought out their own home assistant portal. It's a device, got a camera, follows you around the room. No problems there. What technology did they use in order to support the voice recognition piece of it? Alexa. So you've got a Facebook device in your home that you're using to converse with Granny, who lives in Australia. The voice recognition technology is being provided by Amazon. All of that voice data is being collected by Amazon through the Facebook portal. A really interesting dichotomy that you face there as a consumer, right? Because you can't use Alexa if you don't have an account with Amazon. So we're seeing a lot of blurring of the boundaries around how we integrate voice, and we need to take a much more mature and grown-up approach to what do we think about voice data.